Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin. I want to talk to you today about Stephen Lewis, or talk with Stephen Lewis, so that you can hear what we have to say today. So Stephen has been writing professionally as a journalist and a copywriter since 1994. He's lectured in PR and journalism, and his book on persuasive storytelling has been taught at Sydney University and translated for international distribution, which is actually pretty cool. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But Stephen is also an expert in AI copywriting. And I first came across Stephen when I was watching an AI training that he did for Ilana Wexler's Teach Traffic community, of which I'm a member. And the training was so good that I did some research to find out what else he does, which is actually quite a lot. Now, he's the founder of Tailist Agency, which provides direct response copywriting services, and he runs a ChatGPT workshop that's very popular, not to mention topical and relevant, and we might talk about that a little bit later in the interview as well. I reached out to ask, after I listened to his training, I reached out to ask if he'd be a guest on the podcast, and then I discovered that he was the person responsible for writing the copy on one of my clients' websites, which I have admired for a long time because it's so effective. So, Stephen, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Trudy. It's lovely to be here.
First of all, before we get stuck into my curiosity-based questions, can you just share with our listeners a little bit about your background, how you get to the point where you actually have a direct response copywriting agency, etc., and just fill people in there.
Taking some big leaps. So when I say I'm going to go back to 1994, we're not going to go year by year, because 1994 is further away than I like to remember it. But I built my first website in 1994. So you're talking about a dial-up modem at about the same speed as a fax machine. You had to unplug your telephone and plug it into your computer. And I decided what would be great would be to have a business building websites for people once I had learned. And you have to remember, websites back then, I think in the beginning, you couldn't even have an image easily on a website. So a website was a really basic piece of kit. And I would end up in these meetings where I'd say, you need a website. And they'd say, that's interesting. Tell us what a website is. What is the World Wide Web? And we'd have that conversation. And then they'd say, and we've also heard of email. Tell us, what email? And you'd tell them, and then they'd say, that was really interesting, but we've got an ad in the Yellow Pages. We're really set with our marketing. I couldn't get that business off the ground, right? That was my first online business. I couldn't make it work. I had a blog at the time, which wasn't called a blog because that term wasn't invented until the 2000s. So I had what was called a zine, an e-zine. And I wrote for that e-zine. And then I just realized I had this epiphany that I had always wanted to write. And I won't bore you with my childhood tippy-tapping on a typewriter, but I did want to write. And so I sent off a few things to newspapers, and one thing led to another. And in particular, because I had expertise in this newfangled thing called the internet, I was allowed to write a weekly column about the internet. And because I was in Hong Kong at the time, as a native English-speaking professional writer, you get contacted by companies like Microsoft and Intel who say, how about you write for us? So I ended up doing what I thought was copywriting then, and I now realize was brochure writing. And that led me, and now I'm going to stop there because that only takes us to about 1998. But essentially the point is, after that, I fell into this world of looking into copywriting and researching and understanding how much more there is to it than writing a brochure that has no hope in hell of doing anything that the company writing the brochure thinks the brochure should do.
I think it's interesting going back to the beginnings of when it starts to become really supportive tool that you can use, although hard work. When I'm talking about the internet, the opportunities are immense. And it's fascinating because way back in the dark ages, when the internet was new, I used to be a tutor at university for a new class on this thing called the World Wide Web, helping students learn how to create websites. And I'm going, oh, wow, you're just scrambling, trying to stay ahead of them and being able to answer their questions. It was a new thing, and being able to spot the opportunities actually made it quite an interesting time. But I'm interested in the trajectory of your journey. So you started out, you realized that you really wanted to write. You ended up getting some work with some pretty big organizations that let hone your skills, develop those, and take us from the world of paper brochure writing. I remember this because there was a lot of websites that were just online brochures and didn't do much more than that. Take us the rest of the way from that point in time until where you are today, where you actually have an agency that helps people do several different types of writing, but it's very targeted and specific type of writing. What was that journey like?
I spent a lot of time as a journalist. I wrote about all kinds of things, not just the internet. I was a television critic, which was probably the best job ever. And I wrote about technology, but I'd write about adventure races, travel, and all kinds of things. So I wrote a lot about privacy. Lots of the things we were worried about with privacy, I was writing about in the late 90s. From there, I got into PR because I wanted to move to Australia, and Australia didn't feel it needed any more journalists. So it wasn't issuing any visas for journalists. But weirdly, it would issue visas for PR people because God knows the world needs more PR people, right? So I reinvented myself as a PR person, came here and worked in PR for a law. Again, it's all storytelling, right? PR is find the story, write the story in a way that persuades a journalist that it's interesting, which is hard. That's hard work because most businesses are inherently boring. And the things that they think are interesting are not. And that, again, fits in. So it's all part of a coherent story because journalism is about asking rude questions, getting answers and finding out what's actually interesting, which is often not what the person you're interviewing thinks is interesting or wants you to think is interesting. Then you get into PR where you're on the other side of the equation. You've got your client's a partner in a law firm. He's a legend in his own lunchtime. He feels that everything that he says is inherently fascinating simply because it comes out in him saying it. It's not fascinating. So you've got to learn a bit of diplomacy, which is not a natural skill of mine, and find the actual story. And then, as I say, present it in a way that a cynical journalist who gets 300 press releases a day is going to pick out of their pile. So again, that goes to your chops because I've actually got a whole list of things here that I'm planning to write about in my newsletter, which is the shit that I get in my mailbox. And it has no hope of ever getting a response, largely because it doesn't really ask for a response. So the PR comes into that. And then I made a fabulous move in about 2005. I started a social media agency. So to put that in context, 2005, I had a podcast. Twitter didn't start until 2006. You couldn't get a Facebook account outside a US university until probably about I had an agency in 2005. Idiot. So you have all of these conversations with people that are like, oh, Stephen, social media, tell me what that is. Oh, how that sounds very fascinating. But I've got an ad in the Yellow Pages. I read something the other day that said it wasn't until 2010 that more than half of businesses had a website. And I was still trying to get them into social media, and more than half of them didn't even have a website. I was insane. So that is why now when it comes to AI, I teach it. I'm not trying to build shit for you. I will teach you what it is because I've had conversations about, Stephen, tell me, what is this thing? I went from there, I went in-house. I went into AM as an internal communications person. And again, that was absolutely fascinating because your job as an internal communications person is to make intensely boring shit interesting to employees. Again, you're dealing with people who think the employee is hostage. That's fascinating. They think because I pay Trudy to get here at 9 o'clock and stay till 5, Trudy will also feel obligated to read every bit of garbage the CEO sends out in an email, even though she knows it's as verifiably true as something coming out of North Korea. And you're constantly trying to work with people to make it interesting, make it true, make it relevant. It's all copywriting. The whole thing is copywriting. And in the background, that whole time, I was studying the mechanics of copywriting, the fact that there are proven frameworks. Like everybody thinks it's creative, which it is, but there was a great copywriter called Eugene Schwartz who wrote one of the seminal books on copywriting, which is called Breakthrough Advertising. And Schwartz said, great copy is not written, it is assembled. And by that, he meant it's research. If you're not researching the audience, the competitors, the other things the audience is consuming, and all of that, you have no chance of succeeding in writing something that's interesting. But also, as you do that, you will be gathering the Lego bricks that you're going to use to build what you're building. Whereas I think a lot of people think copywriting is, you tell me you've got a mortgage broking business, I say, give me 20 minutes. Trudy is the leading mortgage broker on the North Shore, And then we all go, fabulous. Trudy's got a brilliant website. Just wait till her mum sees it. She'll be so proud. And it's not. You've got to find out what makes Trudy different. Why don't people trust mortgage brokers? Why are they reluctant to use a mortgage broker? Where have they been burnt before? And once you start understanding all of that, then you bring it together. And so that's what I was really learning in the background in these different environments. And then I said to AM, I need to go part-time, because my value to you is that I don't sound like any of you. And if I stay here 5 days a week, I will start to sound like you, and then I will be no good as your translator. So you need to let me go 2 days a week and start my own business and do my own thing. And they said, okay, as long as you don't work for anyone who competes with us. And I thought, I get 3 days a week of working in financial services. I'm very happy not to work in financial services the other 2 days of the week. That was fine. And I built Taylist from there, working for all sorts of people. But the people that we do best for are people who are experts in what they do, but are shit at persuading people of the value of what they do, which is really 98% of experts. They just can't. They're too close to their own material.
But not everybody has the ability of put them together in such a way that it tells a story, it hangs together, it makes people want to keep reading the next word. It is a skill set. It's not something that you just are born knowing how to do. I'm fascinated with the whole concept of 10,000 hours of practice before you are a bit of a master or an expert. Just off the top of your head, how many thousands of hours of writing experience do you think you've accumulated over the years?
My first letter to the newspaper was published when I was 12, and so that was 40 years ago. And that would have taken me 3 hours to write a letter that was about that long, because you're drafting and you're redrafting and you're really thinking. So I would say it's in count. What I would say to your point is that, and I know you weren't saying this, but I think it's important to out loud to somebody who's listening, that 10,000 hours of practicing how to write is not 10,000 hours of answering your emails. That's not the kind of writing that you're talking about or I'm talking about. Because again, as a copywriter, it's a constant frustration that people are like, I could do this myself. I write all day. You're like, you tippity tap emails, scheduling meetings or writing up meeting notes. Writing something that is actually going to get somebody from A to B to do something, feel something or think something, is a completely different kettle of fish from, hey, Trudy, I can't make 7. How about 7:15? That's a different kind of writing, and that does not count towards your 10,000 hours.
I think that's well worth mentioning. Just because you can write in one particular way or for one particular medium, it's not the same thing as trying to get somebody to do something. As you say, do, think, or feel, which is at the core of persuasive direct response type copywriting. In terms of the work that you do, you said you focus on working with experts who are really good at what they do, but they're not good at the written side of things, the copywriting side of things. How do you go about extracting what's in their heads and turning it into good persuasive copy, like the copy that I saw on my client's website that you and your team had written?
The key is to ask the right questions and not to be frightened to ask stupid questions. And that took a really long time, because I used to think when I started, as you said, I've worked for a lot of big names, but that doesn't mean I've done good work. They're good companies, and I did shit work in the late 90s. Because I thought writing a brochure for Microsoft was about writing something that sounded nice. And that's just so embarrassing in retrospect. I was young in the 90s, so that's okay. But it's that ability. I didn't feel at that time I could ask a stupid question. One of the questions I ask in various forms now, more often than anything else, is, so what? Whereas I did not feel as a guy in my mid-20s that I could say to Microsoft or Intel, so what? So this server is faster than the last server you made. So what? What does that matter? You're trying to sell servers to the education department in Bangalore. What does it matter to them that it's faster? Or it's got 8 processors, not 4? I didn't feel I could ask that. I just went, oh, I hate 8 processors. Oh, and the previous one had 4. And I'll make a big deal of that. Meanwhile, somebody in the education department in Bangalore is going, I don't care. It's going to cost me 30 million to upgrade my servers for that much extra speed or whatever it might be. I don't give a shit. But I didn't ask the right questions. And most businesses, and this is what I find with experts, they don't ask themselves the right questions. They've spent their careers solving problems So they know what your problem is, and they know their language for fixing it. Even though they work with these people all the time, they don't know how they describe the problem and their language for fixing it. So they constantly want to spray you, often, and often the worst ones have made up their own bloody language. So they're spraying you with terms that nobody understands, not even other experts, because they've gone to a branding agency and made up some shit. Your client already doesn't understand what you do, and then you've said, but wait, before I explain it, I'm going to have to teach you another language. It's insanity. Imagine actually saying to your client, listen, Trudy, I know you only speak English, but first, let me teach you French, and then we can talk about copywriting. Let's do that first. It's insanity, but people are too close to it. So it's about asking stupid questions. So often I'll find, say, a marketing manager's brought me in, and then I'm sitting with the big cheese, and the big cheese is there for 20 minutes thinking, who is this? And then after 20 minutes, because I do this for a living, you've absorbed enough and you go, well, hang on a minute. Are you saying that what you do is like this? And I have that experience where people are like, oh, the fool was listening. The fool paid attention and the fool has managed to pull some things together. Or you work with engineers who seriously want to resist you simplifying what they do to anything meaningful to a non-engineer. So that can be really hard. And I've had bad experiences there, definitely.
I'm smiling because yes, to the engineers and some IT people just simply not wanting things simplified because to them it removes the mystique. But that sounds a little cliquey in some ways, but it's really not. It's how they've learned to describe things to themselves. And if people can't understand that, then it's difficult to translate.
Also, they are mean to each other. Engineers are very mean to each other. They are brutalized growing up to be very precise and to speak correctly, and they fear looking stupid in front of the other engineers. And I understand that. It's helping them to see, but you're not talking to the other engineers. When I go to the website of Arup or GHD, NDY, I'm not an engineer. I'm looking to hire an engineer. When I go to the doctor, I'm not looking for a doctor to talk to me like I'm a doctor. So I don't want to hear about lesions, infarctions, and whatever. I want to hear about heart attacks, cuts and bruises and so on. And that's the difference. Sure, a doctor may look foolish talking to other doctors in the terms in my doctor would talk to me, but they're different. And helping people understand you're not an engineer right now, you're a communicator. Again, really difficult with engineers. Always a fun job, but really difficult.
I was just harking back to one of the other things you said about the whole what your framework is and making up branded terms or branded names that it takes you 10 minutes to explain what it is or what it means. It's interesting. How do you get around that, and how do you suggest to people that maybe they might not like to use that kind of language?
The older I get, the more direct I get. And I guess either people like it or they don't like it. The more confident I've become in that if you can't explain it to me, you are not going to be able to explain it to your target audience. So I'm confident in that. And I don't mean because I'm super smart, because I'm giving you all of my attention. You've had me come into a room for an hour. I'm not a customer, I'm a supplier. So I am paying attention. I am listening to you. I am trying to understand you. Whereas your punter is on their iPad in front of the TV with a child who's trying to talk to them, dinner's on the stove, and they are not giving you their full attention. If you can't explain it to somebody who is trying his level best to understand you, you are sure as hell not explaining yourself. Because, for instance, with what I used to say to Intel, because Intel would say to me, how technical are you? And I'd say, I'm more technical than the average bear. Like, you'd rather have me trying to fix your Windows settings than my mum, but I'm not a guy who could build a computer from the ground up. But on the other hand, tell me about your audience. And they'd say, our audience is the CIO or maybe the CEO. And I'd say, how technical are they? They're like, oh, no, they're not technical. And I'm like, good. So if you can't explain it to me, who's trying really hard to understand you, you won't explain it to them. And I've worked for surgeons, IT people, engineers, professors, what's human factors. What's a human factor? These are things you have to find out. I've worked for all kinds of people, and the process is always the same. Stupid questions, but they like it generally because the questions are all about them, and everybody loves answering questions that are all about them. And you're paying real attention, which people like. And then they like the results because the result is people understand them. They have a website where somebody phones up and says, hey, Trudy, I read your website and I see you do this. And they're like, no one has ever understood what I've done before. They've phoned up because they know they have to get a quantity surveyor, a town planner, a mechanic, a something, but they've never phoned up and said, and I understand your value. Let's begin to talk. It's a complete revelation for them.
Absolutely. So I want to come back a little bit more towards the beginning of your journey, or in your early years of your writing journey, when you're developing your skill sets and things like that. And for a lot of people listening, thinking that they might like to start using some of their expertise and write about their area of expertise as a way of starting to generate a little bit of revenue or earning money, is something that probably has crossed a few people's minds more than once, but they may not have ever taken any action. If somebody was in that situation and thinking back to your early days, what would be the one or two most important things that they could possibly do that would help them to start to build up the confidence that they could do this?
So firstly, you are an expert, so that's good. My father first said that to me, and I've read it in 1,000 books since, because my father lectured at university very early on in his life, and he said, as long as I'm one chapter ahead in the textbook than my students, I'm okay. He was really young. I mean, this is before I was born, really young. And I think that's true. As long as you're more than the person you're writing to, then you're the expert they need, right? Your GP doesn't know as much about a health condition as a specialist, but your GP is where you go first and you learn more about it than you knew before, and then you go to the next person. As long as you are one rung up the ladder from the other person, then you do know more. And what you have to think about is, if you were explaining it, generally speaking, one, stop overestimating your reader. Readers know a lot less than you think they do. We know a little bit about a lot of things. You think it's obvious, like I did with the internet. I'm like, oh, all these people will want a website because obviously they can see what's coming. And I'm doing that in 1994, 95, and it was another 15 years before even half of businesses had a bloody website. But I thought I'd have a job for about 15 minutes and then everyone would have a website and it would all be over. Same with social media. People don't know as much as you think they do. So bring it right back. Don't bury the lead. Accept that certainly when you're starting out, probably the first 4 paragraphs of what you've sweated blood over were just you clearing your throat. And probably the safest thing you can possibly do is, just without even rereading them, draw red lines for your first 4 paragraphs, because that'll be the bit where you will have said, in 1968, a committee met to do this and do that, and then they met again, and then they met 400 other times, and then they invented the birth control pill, and you're like, no, they invented the birth control pill as the bit that goes up at the top. That's the interesting bit, not how many times a committee met before that happened. When I was at AMP, I wrote a guide to writing good emails, and that was my example. I said, look, here's a typical AMP email, which would be, 6 months ago, we formed a committee to review safety. The committee met monthly. We investigated best practices about whether you should take your handbag with you when you leave the building or don't. We determined that you should leave your belongings behind and leave as soon as possible. Oh, and by the way, the building is on fire right now. You're like, no, the building is on fire right now is what you put up at the top. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but people don't. So the job of the headline is to get somebody to read the first line. The job of the first line is to get somebody to read the second line. It's no good if your 5th paragraph is gold medal winning if people stop reading after the first 3 lines. It doesn't matter. Don't think they're going to stay with you. They won't. You have to earn every second that they read. So that would be my top pieces of advice. 1, understand who you're writing to so that you know what's interesting to them. Then be interesting to them without assuming that they know more than they do. Be certain you know how much they know. Does that help?
It makes a lot of sense. It's because I've done a lot of writing, probably not anywhere near as much as you have, but I have done a fair whack of writing. And it's the first few sentences that are the hardest. If you can't get those right, you might as well not bother writing the rest of it. Because you're right, people won't read. Which brings me to the next thing I want to just quickly touch on before we have to wrap up. And that is, you've mentioned a couple times, And I'm smiling because I know exactly where your head was at the time in terms of building websites before the world's ready for them, doing social media stuff before they even exist, the social platforms even exist. At the moment, the world's sitting in this whole new emerging space of AI. With AI, it's well beyond, hey, this is new. We're at the place where people absolutely have to learn how to use it if they don't want to get left behind. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your view of the intersection of AI, things like ChatGPT, and the work that a writer does as an expert?
I think where I like using AI is as a sounding board, because writing is inherently lonely because I don't play the piano, and I've seen two people sitting side by side and playing the piano, but my understanding is that most pieces of music are not written for four hands. So it's a one-person job. And then you've probably got somebody in your life that you can occasionally run something past or talk through something. But then that person's going to expect you to listen to their shit about what they're doing in some kind of reciprocity situation, and that's tedious. You will eventually burn through the people who are willing to hear you talking aloud and thinking aloud. To me, a big use of AI is that ability to have a lot, like a really knowledgeable toddler with terrible motor skills. That's what AI is. If you know how to prompt the AI, you can get a huge amount of information out of it. So to give you an example of what I was doing just before we spoke today, I'm writing something for a lawyer, a litigation specialist, and we're developing a product that they can go to market with. It's a service, but it's a productized service. And because they're a firm of litigators, I'm interested in military language, because litigation is a battle. It's not called a court battle for nothing. This product is about protecting people against litigation. So I'm thinking in terms of armorification. And that led me to thinking about, we've all seen Top Gun, the red teaming idea of you've got an adversary who is trained to test your skills in cybersecurity. You've got ethical hackers. With ChatGPT, I've been asking questions. What do you call somebody who, it was funny actually, I was asking it, what do you call somebody who looks for chinks in armor? I was not allowed that prompt because chink is a racial slur, but chink is also about a gap, which has nothing to do with the racial slur. But there's a blanket ban on chink, even if you're putting it in terms of armor. I couldn't get that answer, but I got a lot of answer about red teaming, aggressive forces, the terminology that I wanted to borrow from. I would say things like, what did Sun Tzu say about this? And it'll give you the things that Sun Tzu said. So you've got someone. So yes, you can Google Sun Tzu quotations, but with AI, you can say, look, what did Sun Tzu say about knowing your enemy and probing your enemy and that kind of stuff? So you're getting all of that quickly, whether or not you believe that AI will ever be able to write as well as you can. The level of information it has can accelerate how fast you can write the things that you want to write. It can give you frameworks, and it's tireless. I've used it. Give me 52 headlines for this piece that I'm writing, and I don't like any of them. They're all shit. But one, and you think, okay, that's no good, but it's given me another idea. Or if I take a bit of number 3 and mix it with a bit of number 4 and then do this, then you're just getting that acceleration, like the velocity that you can get from it. Your ability to understand your punt is just, from a writer's point of view. Dan Kennedy, who's a marketing expert, has an idea which may or may not be original, but is incontrovertible, that there's a messaging triangle. It's the who, the what, and the medium. Who are you talking to? What do you want to say to them? And what's the medium in which you're going to do it? And it all starts, in my opinion, I haven't seen him say this, but I don't see how you can't start with the who, because I think most businesses want to start with the what. I know what I want to say to you. First of all, you could just be wasting your time. ChatGPT's knowledge of the who is unbelievable, because it has read more than you could read in 10,000 lifetimes about your avatar. An example that I like to use is, I was writing a website for a counselor, and she counsels teenagers. Her avatar for her website, the person to whom she's writing, is the mother of a teenager. And so we did this exercise that I teach in my course about how to pull information out of ChatGPT about her avatar mothers of teenagers who are in trouble. And she was crying as she sat there because it turned out her avatar was her, because she's got a teenager, he's in trouble. So the people she's trying to help are people just like her. So she, as a human, was able to validate that when ChatGPT was saying things like, this mother probably feels that her husband doesn't understand her, he's underestimating the seriousness of the situation, he thinks it's just a phase the teenager's going through. The school probably resourced and is trying to tell the mother that everything's going to be okay, and every fiber of her being is saying it isn't. That is a robot telling you exactly what somebody's inner feelings are. And I had an actual human version of that sitting next to me saying, yes, that's true. You imagine the difference if you're trying to write persuasively between trying to write to women aged between 40 and 48 who are the mothers of children aged between 13 and 18 who live in this part of the United Kingdom, and writing to Susan. And Susan drives this kind of car and has this kind of kid, and these are the thoughts, and she's feeling guilty as a mother herself. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, all right. So if you're feeling guilty as a mother yourself, what might I be saying? The result is that my client now has a website that says, look, you might be feeling guilty about this yourself, but actually the reality is that as a parent, you're often too close to the situation. Your kid just can't hear you. It's not that my advice to your kid is going to be better than your advice to your kid. It's that your kid will hear me and they won't hear you because you're mum, and already that stopped. It's all of that, rather than her competitors, where websites are full of emotionally resilient teenagers. It's very important and it's a lifelong skill. I'm a counselor and I help teenagers develop emotional resilience. And you're like, yeah, you and all the others. All of which is a bit of a digression from your question about where AI fits in. But I think the point I'm trying to make is the breadth of its abilities are extravagant, and that your ability to raise your own level, whatever your level is, and to your point, therefore, if you don't raise your own level, then you are really going to suffer because somebody else is raising their level to be the same as you, if you're great, or be better than you. And that's the existential risk to people right now.
Yes, and it's valid. Nearly the last question, and because we could talk about this for a very long time, is that if somebody's experimented a little bit with ChatGPT or some of the other AI tools, they just haven't been able to get past the rubbish that you always get when you first try to do something. What would be a couple of the things that they need to think about as they try to get the thing to do what they want it to do?
This is interesting in the sense that when I said I started a website, it was hard. You had to unplug your cable and do whatever. You had to learn stuff. And even social media in the beginning, starting a podcast in 2005 was hard. You had to get all kinds of extra plugins for your computer because they weren't built for you to plug in a microphone and become a radio star. We've got better at making things easier for you to get started. So ChatGPT sits there, the box is there, the cursor winks at you, you type something into it and you go, this is drivel, I don't see what all the fuss is about. Because you haven't had to the mechanics, the language of it, and how to push it. So the absolute number one thing that I say to people is think of ChatGPT as a colleague. If a colleague started work today, you would not swivel in your chair and say, Gary, I need you to write an email to all of our customers about the sale on Tuesday, and then swivel back in your chair because Gary, who's been in the building for 5 minutes, is going to knock out this email and it's going to make sense. How long does it take to make a human employee useful? Months, weeks at least? Gary's got to learn the company, the way the company talks, who the customers are, what the customers have heard before. So if you're talking to ChatGPT's Gary and he's walked in the door on day one and he doesn't even know everybody's name, you will get crap results. If you sit there and prompt it properly, hey, ChatGPT, I'm writing an email to my customers. My customers look like this. This is the kind of way we talk to them. This is the sort of thing I'm looking for. I don't want it to be more than 200 words. Please dial back on the emojis because ChatGPT, for some reason, likes emojis just extraordinary. That it's like Lucky Charms tipping them out of a box of cereal, just emojis everywhere. The more you brief it, so to put that into some kind of meaningful context for people, the ChatGPT prompt window looks like a prompt would be one sentence, like it would be like a short tweet. Whereas the ChatGPT prompts that I'm making now will often look like that. They might be 200 words, they might be 250 words in a single prompt, because you've got to give ChatGPT the context that you'd give a colleague. Because ChatGPT is super knowledgeable, but it's not a mind reader about your objectives and your audience. If you're not telling it, then don't be surprised. You ask it to write an email to your mum and you're like, my mum would not enjoy that email. But you didn't tell ChatGPT anything about your mother or her likes or dislikes or so. Briefing is everything, and experimentation is absolutely critical. And even if you don't like the way it writes, the information that it can offer you in the way of research is extraordinary.
Yes, it is. And being able to write very effective prompts, I think, is really the key to being able to take that next level step, if you want to use jargon, basically boost your skill set so that you can compete with people who are either good at it, or you'll be better than people who aren't using this tool to help expand the skill set that's there. I know you run workshops, they're live workshops, and you basically walk people through how to actually do this and to develop this as a skill. What would you say would be the number one challenge that people who come into your workshop are facing before they come into the workshop?
I think the problem they're facing before they come in is speed. They always under pressure to write things quickly. What I would say, and I'm conscious because I can picture all their lovely faces right now, I don't want to be too critical, but what I would say is they probably haven't realized they're not very persuasive. And this is similar to all marketing stuff. What's the problem people think they have? The problem they think they have is they can't produce enough content quickly enough. The problem is that they might not be producing enough content. Probably they're producing too much. They might not be producing it quickly enough. The real problem is it's not effective. Like those things from my mailbox, it doesn't matter how quickly they produce them. None of them is going to get a phone call. And the reasons for that are clear. What the course teaches is the kind of thinking that you need to do before you write something. The problem they come in with, they're overworked and they can't produce content fast enough. The way they leave is they can produce content quickly and also have a really higher quality of content, in that the content, which is a word I loathe, is more likely to persuade somebody to do something than what they were writing before.
Absolutely, makes perfect sense. Stephen, if people were interested in learning more about the workshops that you put on, or just in getting in touch with you, where would they go?
They can go to Taleist.agency, which is TALEIST.agency. And when you get there, there will be 1,000 invitations for you to sign up for the mailing list. But there is also a link in the resources bar to the mailing list. Sign up for the mailing list. I send out a tip 3 or 4 times a week. And I think that's the kind of thing that people would find really helpful. And obviously my email address is all over the site.
Okay, we'll make sure we put those in the show notes. And I just remembered I had a question I was going to ask. I mentioned at the very beginning that you'd written a book. What's the name of your book?
I wrote a book called How to Write Perfect Press Releases. And the title is Pure SEO, because it's not just about how to write press releases. It's about what we were discussing at the beginning, which is how to identify the story in your business that's going to be interesting to somebody else. It is positioned, as I say, how to write a press release book, but it is actually, if used properly, a book on how to present my stories in a way that is interesting to somebody else. It's not a storytelling book in the sense of beginning, middle, and end. There are good books for that, but it's about how to concentrate somebody else. We are all brilliant at talking about what is interesting to us, and that is why a significant amount of writing fails, because it's not interesting to the other person. So how to write perfect press releases will get you there.
Thanks for that. And I'll make sure I put that in the show notes as well. Stephen, thank you so much. It's been really interesting speaking with you. And just thanks again for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Rudy. It's been great to be here.